All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling something you might think you already know about,
Yeah, creatine.
but we're going way beyond just muscle growth. This is about unlocking the full potential of this supplement, from
Hmm.
overall health and fitness to maybe even how long we can actually thrive.
That's right.
And we're doing it based on the Brink Creatine report that you sent us, asking for the full picture of all these benefits.
Absolutely. And it is a fascinating picture because this stuff that's often associated with, gym bros and hardcore athletes,
Right.
it's actually deeply tied to like fundamental processes in every cell in your body.
Hmm.
We're talking about energy at the most basic level, and that has implications far beyond just, building bigger biceps.
Okay, so before we get to all that, let's back up a bit and just make sure everyone's on the same page. What exactly is creatine? Like, what is this stuff we're talking about?
Well, at its core, it's a natural compound. Your body actually makes it from three amino acids, methionine, glycine, and arginine. And the average person stores around 120 grams of it, mostly as creatine phosphate in our muscles.
So we all have some floating around already. Can we get enough just from food, or is that where the supplement comes in?
You can find it in some foods for sure, like beef, herring, salmon, but the amounts are pretty small. To get the kind of doses that research shows have, real impact, we're talking a teaspoon of creatine powder.
Oh,
You'd
yeah.
have to eat pounds and pounds of meat every day to match that. So yeah, supplementation is definitely the way to go if you want to, increase those creatine stores significantly.
Okay, so we take our creatine supplement. Now what? What happens inside our bodies? How does this stuff actually work on a cellular level? I mean, this is where it gets really interesting, right?
Oh, absolutely. So creatine's main role is tied to ATP adenosine triphosphate.
APP.
Think of ATP as the universal energy currency of your cells. Like, it's literally the fuel that powers everything they do, from muscle contractions to brain function. And it's produced in the mitochondria, those little powerhouses inside every cell. Now, every time ATP is used, it loses some of its energy and becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate.
So it needs to be recharged, basically.
Exactly. And guess what steps in to recharge it?
Creatine.
Creatine phosphate. It's like a rapid recharge station. When ATP is depleted and becomes ADP, creatine phosphate donates a phosphate molecule, instantly turning that ADP back into ATP, back into usable energy.
So the more creatine phosphate we have hanging out, the faster our cells can get that energy back.
Exactly. And that's crucial for anything that demands quick bursts of high energy, whether you're talking about lifting weights or just, thinking hard.
Okay, that makes sense, especially for athletes who need that explosive power.
Right.
And when we talk about creatine, the report really emphasizes creatine monohydrate. Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, creatine monohydrate is kind of the gold standard. It's the most researched form, and the evidence is just overwhelming. Our bodies absorb over 90% of it. You might see other forms out there, like creatine citrate or creatine ethyl ester. But when we talk about the real benefits backed by science, we're mostly talking about good old creatine monohydrate.
Okay, good to know. So we've covered the basics. Now let's get into some of these surprising areas the report covers, starting with sarcopenia. For those of us who aren't familiar with that term, what exactly is it?
So sarcopenia is basically age-related muscle loss. It's a gradual decline in muscle mass, strength, and function that starts, creeping in around age 40. And then after 75, it can really accelerate.
Oh, wow.
The report emphasizes that while we hear a lot about osteoporosis, bone loss, sarcopenia is just as important because it directly impacts an older person's mobility, their independence, their whole quality of life. We don't always think about our muscles as we age, but they're absolutely crucial to staying active and healthy.
It's so true. We often take those things for granted until they start to go. So how does creatine help with this? Like, how does it fight sarcopenia?
Well, this is where the research gets really exciting. There have been a bunch of studies looking at what happens when older adults, typically over 65, take creatine about 5 grams a day while also doing resistance training.
Okay.
The results are pretty consistent. This combination leads to significantly greater increases in fat-free mass, which is mostly muscle,
Wow.
and you also see real improvements in strength. Things like being able to straighten your knee or flex your foot with more power compared to those who just do the exercise alone.
So it's not just about slowing down muscle loss, but actually building more muscle even later in life.
That's exactly it. And there's even a study that suggests these gains in strength and lean tissue might stick around for at least 12 weeks after stopping creatine, as long as they keep up the resistance training. Though, to really maintain those higher creatine levels long term, consistent use is probably best.
That's amazing. Now, the report dives into something called cellular energetics as the secret of aging. What does that mean, and how does creatine play a role?
It's a pretty fascinating concept. The report suggests that a key difference between younger and older adults lies in how efficiently their cells produce and use energy. That's what cellular energetics refers to.
Hmm.
So, as we get older, our cells can become less efficient at producing ATP, at getting rid of waste products, and at protecting themselves from damage.
Oh, wow.
And this decline in energy production is especially noticeable in tissues that have really high energy demands, like, you guessed it, our muscles and our brains. Older adults tend to have lower levels of ATP and creatine phosphate just in general, and it takes them longer to replenish those stores after activity.
So creatine, by helping us recharge that ACP more effectively, could really address that age-related energy decline.
Precisely. By supporting those ATP levels, it helps these crucial tissues, the muscles in the brain, get the energy they need to function at their best. And the report actually talks about broader strategies for healthy aging,
Okay.
like maintaining those ATP-CP levels with supplements, not just creatine, but things like acetyl L-carnitine, alpha-lipoic acid, CoQ10, and boosting our cells' antioxidant defenses with things like glutathione, whey protein, and NAC.
Interesting.
It's all about supporting those cellular powerhouses as a foundation for healthy aging and longevity.
Makes sense. All right, moving on to another surprise from the report, the anti-inflammatory effects of creatine. That's not something you would automatically connect with this supplement.
I
But
know, right?
yeah.
It's pretty cool. There was a study on a group of experienced runners. They took a fairly high dose of creatine, 5 grams, 4 times a day, for 5 days before running a 30-kilometer race.
Okay, that's a lot of running.
Definitely. And researchers found that the runners who took creatine had much lower levels of those markers that indicate cell damage and inflammation. Things like creatine kinase, CK, prostaglandin E2, PGE2, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF alpha.
Wow, so their bodies were better at handling that stress.
It seems that way. What's even more interesting is that the creatine completely blocked the increase in lactate dehydrogenase, LDH. That's another key marker of muscle damage that you'd usually see after that kind of intense exercise.
So basically, creatine helped protect their muscles.
Exactly. And the report suggests that it might help our bodies deal with the stress and inflammation that comes from any kind of intense physical activity. Of course, more research is needed to know if it works the same with moderate exercise or in people who aren't, training for marathons.
Right. But still, that's pretty incredible. And speaking of things that are pretty incredible, let's talk about the brain. The report has a whole section on creatine and brain function. As someone who's always looking for that mental edge, I found this fascinating. What's the connection there?
Well, research is showing that creatine plays a pretty important role in brain health and function, both in terms of keeping our brains sharp and potentially protecting them from injury.
Really?
There was a study on mice and rats showing that creatine actually reduced the amount of brain tissue damage after a traumatic brain injury,
Oh,
and in some cases by up to 50% in the rats. Pretty significant. The researchers think this is because creatine helps those brain cells maintain their energy supply even after the injury.
so having more creatine available helps the brain kind of weather the storm. Could this be helpful for, people who actually experience head injuries in real life?
The report suggests it could. Starting creatine supplementation quickly after a brain injury might actually help minimize damage. And there's even the idea that if you're already taking creatine regularly, you might have some built-in protection against further damage if you were to have an injury. Of course, more research is needed, especially in humans, but the animal studies are definitely promising.
That is pretty amazing. Now, what about for those of us with, healthy brains who just want to stay sharp? Does creatine help with that too?
It seems so. One study looked at vegetarians who tend to have lower creatine levels because they don't eat meat. They found that taking 5 grams of creatine a day for 6 weeks improved their cognitive function in several areas. And this lines up with other research suggesting that the amount of creatine in your brain is linked to better memory and less mental fatigue.
Mm.
The effect might be less dramatic for meat eaters who already get some creatine from their diet, but the report suggests that supplementation can still boost brain creatine levels in both groups, leading to noticeable improvements in cognitive function.
So good for everyone, basically.
Mhm.
The report also talks about the potential role of creatine in neuromuscular diseases, which are, of course, really serious conditions.
Mhm.
What does the research say about that?
There have been quite a few studies looking into this. There's one really well-designed study on people with different forms of muscular dystrophy, MD,
Okay.
and they found that when these folks took creatine, there was a, quote, mild but significant improvement in their muscle strength across the board. Plus, there was a general trend toward being able to do everyday activities better. Other research shows that even short-term creatine can increase high-intensity strength in folks with a range of neuromuscular diseases.
Mm.
And beyond the formal studies, doctors have observed improvements in strength, functionality, and even a reduction in some symptoms for people with various neuromuscular disorders when they take creatine. It seems to be a useful tool for managing these really difficult conditions.
Definitely promising. And the report dives even deeper into brain research, this time focusing on protecting the brain from different kinds of stress and damage. What do they find there?
Well, there's a growing body of evidence that creatine can actually shield those nerve cells from all sorts of threats. For example, in lab studies, they've shown that creatine can protect neurons from the toxic effects of glutamate and beta amyloid, and those are both implicated in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Then there are animal studies that show creatine's protective effects against other harmful substances, even in models mimicking Parkinson's disease. And get this, there's evidence suggesting that creatine might even help protect neurons from the damage caused by low oxygen levels, like what happens during a stroke. It's
Wow.
like a little guardian for our brains.
The report even touches on the potential role of creatine in neurodegenerative diseases like Huntington's and ALS.
Yeah, the research is still early, but there are some interesting findings. Some studies suggest that creatine could have a therapeutic or protective role in these conditions.
Okay.
For example, in a study using a mouse model of ALS, they found that giving creatine improved motor function, helped the mice live longer, and protected against the loss of motor neurons, which is the hallmark of ALS.
Wow.
Of course, we need more research in humans, but it definitely suggests that creatine could play a significant role in supporting brain health in many ways.
This is all pretty incredible, from muscles to brains, and now the report even talks about heart function. How does creatine affect our cardiovascular health?
Well, remember, heart muscle cells also depend on ATP to function properly,
Right.
and people with chronic heart failure often have lower levels of creatine in their heart tissue and impaired function.
Makes sense.
So researchers looked into whether creatine could help. And studies have shown that in patients with chronic heart failure, creatine can actually increase the levels of creatine phosphate in their skeletal muscles, which leads to improvements in muscle strength and endurance.
Interesting.
And what's fascinating is that these benefits happened even without a big increase in the heart's ejection fraction, which is a measure of how much blood the heart pumps out with each beat. Another study on congestive heart failure patients found that creatine improved their strength and endurance and lowered their levels of lactate and ammonia during exercise. That suggests that creatine is improving muscle metabolism. So it might not be directly making a heart pump harder, but it's making those muscles work better, which ultimately improves the quality of life for people with heart issues.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, the report also mentions the effects of creatine on growth hormone.
GH, yeah.
What do they find there?
Well, the research on this is a little more limited, but there's one study that found that a single large dose of creatine, 20 grams, given to healthy men at rest, caused a pretty significant increase in their GH levels within 6 hours.
Hmm.
That's similar to what you'd see after intense exercise. But the report also points out that there was a lot of variation in how people responded. Some saw a big boost in GH, others not so much.
So it's not a guaranteed effect.
Yeah.
But this GH response might be one of the ways creatine contributes to muscle growth and strength.
That's the idea. Growth hormone is definitely involved in muscle building, so this temporary increase could be part of the puzzle. But more research is needed to really understand the connection.
Okay. Another interesting point in the report was the link between creatine and homocysteine levels. Why is that important?
Well, homocysteine is an amino acid, and when you have high levels of it in your blood, it's a risk factor for heart disease. And the report explains that when your body makes creatine, it needs a lot of these things called methyl groups.
Okay.
And it turns out that these same methyl groups are also needed to break down homocysteine,
I see. So it's like they're competing for resources.
Exactly. So researchers wondered if producing more creatine could lead to higher homocysteine because it's using up those methyl groups.
Right.
They did a study in rats and found that supplementing with guanidino acetate, which is a precursor to creatine, actually did increase homocysteine levels.
Oh, wow.
But get this, when they gave the rats actual creatine, it lowered homocysteine.
Really?
It's fascinating. It seems like the way our bodies use creatine has a complex effect on homocysteine, possibly by affecting the demand for those methyl groups. Definitely needs more research in humans, but it's super interesting.
Very cool. The report also mentions potential benefits for conditions like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. What's the connection there?
Well, the thinking is based on how creatine helps in other conditions that involve low energy and muscle weakness, like congestive heart failure, remember?
Right, right.
And it turns out that individuals with fibromyalgia have been found to have lower levels of creatine phosphate and ATP in their muscles. So the idea is if creatine can increase those levels in other conditions, maybe it could help here too. Now, there aren't any direct studies yet showing that creatine improves chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia specifically.
Yeah.
But the report suggests that based on its effects elsewhere, it's worth exploring.
Definitely makes sense. Okay, let's talk about something that's really important, especially with all these potential benefits. Safety. There are a lot of myths and misconceptions about creatine. What does the report have to say about that?
The report is super clear on this. Creatine is one of the most heavily researched performance-enhancing supplements out there, and the vast majority of the scientific evidence supports its safety for healthy individuals. A lot of the negative stuff you hear in the media is just not backed by good research.
So what about the claims that it causes muscle cramps or dehydration or that it's bad for your kidneys?
Yeah, the report addresses all those, like the muscle cramps and dehydration things. Studies have looked into that and haven't found any connection. And as for the kidneys, it's true that creatine can sometimes raise creatinine levels in your blood,
Right.
but that's just because creatinine is a byproduct of creatine metabolism. It's not actually a sign of kidney damage in healthy people.
Okay, good to know.
Lots of studies, both short-term and long-term, in healthy folks, have shown no negative effects on kidney function from taking creatine. There was even a study on animals that already had kidney problems, where creatine didn't seem to cause any additional harm. So the general consensus is that creatine appears to be remarkably safe, probably much safer than many over-the-counter meds.
That is good to hear. Okay, let's get practical. What are the recommended doses of creatine? How much should people be taking?
The report says that for healthy individuals who want to boost their muscle creatine and get those benefits, a daily dose of 2 to 3 grams is usually enough.
Okay.
For people dealing with specific conditions like sarcopenia or maybe some neurological issues, a bit higher, 5 to 10 grams per day might be better. But always best to talk to your doctor for personalized advice, of course.
Absolutely. Now, the report talks about a loading phase when you start taking creatine. What's that all about?
So the loading phase is basically taking a higher dose, usually around 20 grams a day, split into several doses, for 5 to 7 days when you first start. The idea is to quickly saturate your muscle creatine stores, and it does work. But research shows you don't actually need to do this to get the benefits. Taking a lower dose, 3 to 5 grams per day, consistently for several weeks, will also eventually fully saturate your muscles with creatine. Plus, some people get a bit of an upset stomach with those higher doses during loading, so it's really up to you.
So slower and steadier wins the race.
Pretty much.
All right, let's get back to where creatine got its start. Athletic performance. How does it actually help athletes?
Well, like we talked about with cellular energy, creatine enhances the body's ability to regenerate ATP during those short bursts of high-intensity activity. That means athletes can do more reps, sprint further, exert more power before they hit that wall of fatigue. It's especially helpful in sports with those repeated high-intensity efforts and short recovery periods, like weightlifting, sprinting, and a lot of team sports.
But the report does mention that the benefits aren't as clear for endurance sports.
Yeah, that's generally true. Endurance activities rely more on the aerobic system, so those direct ATP boosts from creatine aren't as crucial. But remember those anti-inflammatory effects we talked about?
Right.
There's some research suggesting that creatine might still help endurance athletes by reducing muscle damage and inflammation after really long events.
Okay.
And real-world experience seems to back that up. Power and strength athletes generally love creatine, while endurance athletes have more mixed results.
Makes sense. Now, what about combining creatine with sugar? Why do people do that?
Well, the idea is that if you take creatine with simple sugars that spike insulin, like dextrose or glucose, it can actually enhance how much creatine gets into your muscles.
So the insulin helps shuttle it in.
Exactly. It's like a delivery service, taking the creatine and glucose right into the muscle cells.
Hmm.
This seems to be especially helpful for folks who don't respond well to creatine alone, and it might even boost uptake in people who do respond. Some studies show up to 60% improvement. So a lot of those pre-made creatine powders that have added sugars are based on this idea.
Okay, so that's what's going on there.
Exactly. The companies add dextrose, sometimes other ingredients like glutamine or taurine, all to try and maximize that creatine uptake. And some people even mix their own creatine with grape juice or a sports drink to get that sugar boost. There's not a ton of research directly comparing those complex mixtures to just creatine with a sugary drink, but they can be convenient.
Definitely. One last thing the report mentions. Purity. Is all creatine created equal?
Unfortunately, no. The report points out that quality can really vary between brands. It specifically mentions Creapure as being known for its high purity. A lot of companies that use Creapure will put that right on the label. The report even lists a few brands that used it at the time, like Life Extension, Ultimate Nutrition. But there are many others out there. Looking for third-party testing certifications is always a good idea.
Awesome advice. Well, this has been a pretty incredible deep dive into the Will Brink creatine report. We covered a lot of ground.
Well,
To sum it up for you, our listener, this report highlights the potential benefits of creatine for so many things. Combating age-related muscle loss, reducing inflammation, supporting brain health, whether it's healthy or injured, offering hope for neuromuscular diseases, improving heart function, even influencing homocysteine levels, and possibly helping with chronic fatigue.
It's amazing.
And it's all backed by a solid body of research.
What really blows my mind is how this one relatively simple molecule can have such widespread effects throughout the body. It really drives home how crucial energy production at the cellular level is for our health, how resilient we are, and even how long we live.
so here's a final thought to ponder. Given all these potential benefits and the strong safety profile, how could creatine fit into your own long-term strategy for staying healthy and vital, regardless of your fitness goals? What new questions does this raise for you about the link between cellular energy and your overall well-being? That's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.